Imagine that you are an ancient pagan god with the ram horns that were given to you by the culture you were born in. But those ram horns were stolen from you by early Christian storytellers that adopted them onto a prophet king who wore them. And after that, those horns appeared in the Quran, a symbol of Egyptian paganism, impossibly ending up in one of the holiest books of Islam. So how did you get there? This is the story of the great cultural melt that was happening in the ancient world. Pagan horns, stolen by a Greek conqueror, then claimed by early Christian storytellers, then 500 years later absorbed into the holy book of Islam. That is syncretism. That is what the melt of cultures actually looks like up close. Not a clean handshake between civilizations. A theft, a transformation, a rebirth of the same symbol wearing a completely different mask each time. And the most provocative part? Nobody in any of these traditions wants to admit it happened. So, are you still the ancient pagan demigod? Now let's carefully consider, how did you end up in the Quran? First, let's dive into the Quranic story itself. Because before we trace where it came from, we need to understand what it actually says. And what it says is strange, genuinely strange. In Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter of the Quran, verses 83 to 102, a figure appears with two horns. His name is never revealed, but the Quran tells us he is righteous, powerful, and appointed by God to travel every corner of the earth. And he does that exactly. He makes 3 journeys, 3 trips to the edges of the known world. First, he goes west, all the way to the place where the sun sets. And here is where it gets really strange. The sun is not setting below the horizon, not disappearing into the ocean. According to the Quran, it is setting into the muddy spring. A muddy spring? And standing there, our 2-horned figure is placed between a choice: to punish the people he finds there, or to show them mercy. Then he goes east, to the place where the sun rises, and he finds a nation there completely exposed to it. No shelter, no shade, no protection whatsoever from the burning sun rising directly above them. And then, the 3rd journey, he travels to a place between 2 mountains, where desperate people come to him with a problem. They are being terrorized and oppressed by 2 tribes, Gog and Magog. They offered him everything: money, tribute, payment. Just build us a wall. Keep them out. And our 2-horned figure refuses the payment. He builds the wall anyway, a massive wall of iron and molten brass, so solid that Gog and Magog cannot penetrate it, cannot scale it, cannot dig through it. He does it purely out of devotion to God, takes nothing in return. And then the Quran just moves on. No name revealed, no identity confirmed, no additional information whatsoever. Just the story sitting there in the 18th chapter with no explanation of who this man actually was. And Muslims have been debating that question ever since. So the Quran actually never names him. So who is this 2-horned figure? Who is this mysterious man who is traveling east and west, punishing and saving nations? Three main candidates have been argued over for centuries: Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, and various pre-Islamic Arabian rulers, because all three of those candidates shared similarities for this role as the two-horned Quranic figure. For centuries, the default answer among Islamic scholars was Alexander. No controversy, no debate, it was simply accepted, because there was material evidence about Alexander, especially on the coins. He was always pictured as a two-horned man, and obviously the power around him was tremendous. One person who could rule the world, who could choose between life and death. This amount of power could only be appointed in the Quran to one man, Alexander the Great. The earliest Islamic commentaries explicitly named him as Alexander. Muqatil ibn Sulaiman in the 8th century, Al-Tabari and others all pointed to Alexander. So in the Middle Ages there was no debate among Islamic scholars about who was that mysterious two-horned figure in the Quran. But the Renaissance era scholarship appeared, and with new facts and knowledge about the historical person, people reinvented Alexander. And when that reinvention appeared, they couldn't reconcile him with Islamic dogma, because the identification became a theological problem. The Quran presents Dhul-Qarnayn as a pious monotheist devoted to God. They couldn't, but Alexander claimed himself as a pagan and tried to convince everybody that he himself was a god, which is considered the biggest sin in Islam. And this is the person who appears in the Quran, the holiest book of Islam. The problem was vivid. So the solution was established by modern Muslim scholarship. They largely shifted to Cyrus the Great as an alternative. However, there was a problem with Cyrus. He was never called two-horned anywhere, never associated with Gog and Magog, never linked to this story in any pre-Islamic tradition whatsoever. Alexander, on the other hand, was called the two-horned one in Egypt, Ethiopia, Syria, and Arabia, all centuries before Islam existed. And beyond the coins, there is a historical account that his two-horned attributes were given to him in a sanctuary in Egypt. So the Alexander case can be debated, but very poorly. Actually, the denial of Alexander is not based on evidence. It is based on theological discomfort. But let's tie it to the question: where did the two horns actually come from? There are several sources and myths. In 331 BC, Alexander makes a pilgrimage to the Siwa oasis, deep in the Libyan desert. There sits the oracle of Zeus, Amun, the hybrid of the Greek chief god Zeus and the Egyptian chief god Amun. And that god was a pure evidence of the phenomenon called syncretism, when the culture of the time combines two completely distant gods. In this case, Zeus and the Greek god, and Amun as the purely Egyptian god. Amun was the supreme Egyptian god, king of gods, the hidden one, creator of all things, and he was depicted with ram horns. The oracle declared Alexander the son of Zeus Amun, and with that declaration Alexander inherited the horns, as a son inherits his father's attributes. And this was not a small moment. In Egyptian tradition, the pharaohs themselves were considered sons of Amun. Alexander was claiming the most powerful divine lineage in the ancient world. He inserted himself directly into the Egyptian pharaoh tradition. He basically put himself on the level of the pharaoh, the demigod, demi-human creature appointed to rule the entire world. After Siwa, Alexander began identifying himself as the son of Zeus Amun publicly. It became his brand. Coins depicted him with ram horns were minted first by the successors Ptolemy and Lysimachus, and by the 1st century BC they were all across the Arabian Peninsula. Every trader, every peasant, every ordinary man used to see them day to day. And it was so inscribed in their consciousness that Alexander had 2 horns that they almost believed it. They believed it as it were actually true. The myth became the reality. A hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt calls him literally the son of Amun, and the author of the Alexander Romans explains directly. Being the son of the ram-headed man, the 2 horns became his natural symbol. The Ethiopic version gives another explanation. They say that Alexander had 2 horns not only because of the Egyptian god, but also because he was appointed to rule 2 parts of the world, the East and the West. And that is why he was the 2-horned one. And then there is a Syriac Christian version, and this one is particularly interesting. In the Syriac version, Alexander legend, Alexander himself prays to God and says, "I want you to pay attention to this." He says, "O God, you caused horns to grow on my head so that I may gore with them the kingdoms of the world." The pagan symbol of Amun has now become a gift from the monotheistic God. The 2 horns have been baptized. And that moment, the transformation in the Syriac Christian text is exactly the bridge that leads us to the Quran. So before Islam existed, the 2 horns of Alexander were everywhere. On coins, in text, in Egyptian temples, in Ethiopian manuscripts, in Syrian Christian writings, the legend of the 2-horned one was interpreted, retold, and cultivated by nations, traditions, myths, and cultures across the Arabian Peninsula, Greece, and Minor Asia. Look at the scale. And from this tremendous heritage of cultural melt, Islam delivered the image of the 2-horned man appointed to rule the entire world. So now we know where the horns came from. But how exactly did they travel from an Egyptian temple all the way into the Quran? Because this transmission, this journey, seemed really extraordinary and unrealistic at first glance. But it is more specific than most people realize, and it is documented. The Quran didn't absorb Alexander directly from Greek sources. It went through a Christian filter first. So step 1. The Greek Alexander Romans, pseudo-Callisthenes, written down in Egypt around 200 AD, but circulating orally for centuries before that. These were not historical accounts. There were myths, legends, and interpretations, because the actual historian who traveled with Alexander and recorded everything he did was Callisthenes of Olynthus, a man who eventually despised Alexander's arrogance and was imprisoned until his death. His actual historical works were destroyed, so the legends that survived under his name were invented by admirers. Myths falsely attributed to a dead man who could no longer correct them. Step 2. The oral tradition. Given the geography and the incredibly strong trade links across the region, these myths were already deeply embedded in Arabian oral culture, long before Islam was born. As I mentioned about the coins, that was the material level, the image every ordinary person used to see daily. But beyond those coins, They were the stories, the legends, the tales that parents used to tell their children, all of them already embedded into the Arabian Peninsula culture long before the Quran existed. And we have direct evidence of this. A pre-Islamic Arabian poem by a figure called Tuba already references the sun setting near people on earth, the exact same image that appears in the Quran. This poem existed before Muhammad, before Islam, which means the story was already circulating in Arabian culture independently. The Quran didn't introduce it, it inherited it. But before the Greek story traveled directly into the Arab world, there is one more intermediary, and most surprisingly, it's Christians. Step 3. The Syriac Christian Legend, the Neṣḥānā. Written somewhere between the 6th and 7th century, this is the most important step in the entire chain. The Syriac text is the first narrative to bring everything together: the gates of Alexander, the apocalypses, and Gog and Magog as end of times, all in one place, all connected. And it did something truly remarkable. The texts that were written by Christians Christianized Alexander completely. His horns became a gift from the monotheistic God. He became a pious prophet king. His wall became an apocalyptic barrier. It is no longer the pagan symbol. Those horns are no longer pagan attributes. They are the gift from the monotheistic God. Alexander himself became his righteous king and servant. The transformation was complete. Step 4. The lost Arabic intermediary. Scholars believe there was a lost pre-Islamic Arabic translation that connected the Syrian Christian version directly to the Arabic-speaking world. The chain didn't go Greek to Arabic directly. It went from Greek to Syrian Christian to Arabic. That intermediate Christian layer is everything. Without it, the symbol never makes it into the Quran. Step 5. The Quran itself. 7th century, 16 verses, same horns, same journeys east and west, same Gog and Magog, same iron and brass wall, same end times release. And the Quran itself even confirms these stories were already known. Verse 1883 begins with, "They ask you about Dhul-Qarnayn." Who is asking? That they asked before, for sure. The name of Dhul-Qarnayn was already among the people of the Arabian Peninsula before this verse was revealed. The story was already circulating. The Quran was not introducing something new. It was answering a question about something the people already knew. This is not speculation. This is scholarly consensus. The transmission chain from Egyptian paganism through Greek legend, through Syriac Christianity into the Quran is documented and established. But let's stop talking about the chain in theory. Let's make it undeniable. Let's put the text side by side. This is where the evidence stops being theoretical and becomes visceral. Parallel 1. The two-horned name himself. Alexander was called the two-horned one in Egypt, Ethiopia, Syria, and Arabia. One manuscript after another called him the two-horned one. an attribute that is very difficult to confuse with another person or mix up with another hero in history. The name is unique. The name is his. Parallel 2. Ruling East and West. The Alexander myth says he will rule the entire world from east to west. The Quran at the same time says, "We established his power on earth and gave him the means to all ends." This is a remarkably similar description. And even where it doesn't repeat the original sentence word for word, the meaning remains identical across the translations and the variations derived from the differences between languages. Parallel 3. The sun rising over unprotected people. The Alexander myth says the sun rises over a people who flee and hide from its rays. And the Quran verse 1890 says he found the sun rising on a people with no shelter from it. Word for word, the same scenario. Parallel 4. Gog and Magog behind mountains. The Syriac Neṣḥānā describes a people near their mountains complaining about tribes called Gog and Magog, and the Quran retells this story with the same names, the same mountains, and the same desperate people asking for protection. Parallel 5. The wall materials. This one is particularly specific. In the Alexander myth, 3,000 smiths working iron and brass built the barrier. 3,000. Iron and brass. Now go to the Quran. Dhul-Qarnayn uses iron blocks and pours molten brass over them. Iron and brass, same two materials, same wall, same construction. This is not a general similarity between two stories. This is a pattern so specific it could only have traveled from one tradition to another. You do not accidentally land on the same two obscure building materials across two completely different traditions separated by centuries unless one of them came from the other. Parallel 6. Gog and Magog released at the end of times. The Alexander myth says they will be released at the end of times by God's command and will swarm the world. The Quran and the authentic hadiths say the same. They will break free and swarm from every hill. The apocalyptic ending is identical. Parallel 7. The ruler declines payment. From the ancient Greek story to the Syriac manuscript to the Quran, one fact stays the same. Alexander and then Dhul-Qarnayn refuses to accept tribute, declines the payment, acts purely out of devotion to something greater than himself. As the story traveled across languages, cultures, and centuries, the detail never changed. These are not loose thematic similarities. They are the same story told in the same sequence with the same details and the same materials. So the question is not whether the Quran was influenced by the Alexander legends. The question is how anyone can still argue that it was not, because the evidence provided from story to story convinces us of one thing: why one story grows from another. So far we can see that every tradition we discussed absorbed Alexander positively, but not everyone did. The Zoroastrian Persians had a completely opposite reaction to Alexander. They called him the accused, or the accursed. But how did they came up with such a harsh term? Alexander, during his campaign into Persia, burned Persepolis, the very heartland of the Persian Empire, destroying all the altars and sacred places of the Zoroastrian world. He burned their sacred text. He killed their priests. He dismantled everything they considered holy. So in the Zoroastrian tradition, Alexander was not a hero or a prophet king. he was a demon sent by Ahriman, the evil one, the direct opposite of God. The true Persian kings ruled through the grace of Ahura Mazda, the supreme creator, and Alexander was seen as a destroyer of everything sacred. The same man, the same conqueror, the same two-horned figure that Egypt called the Son of God, that Christianity called a righteous prophet king, that Islam placed in the holiest book, is now viewed by the Zoroastrians as a demon, as the most accused man in all of humanity. But actually it gets even more interesting, because after the Arab Islamic conquest of Persia, Persian poets completely flipped the script. Ferdowsi in his Neṣḥānā, the greatest Persian epic ever written, and Nizami in his own epic poems, perhaps under the influence of Islamic thought, perhaps because times changed and old legends were partly forgotten, started to portray Alexander as a righteous Persian hero, a philosopher king. The same Persians whose ancestors called him the accursed now celebrated him as one of their greatest heroes in their greatest literary works. They deliberately chose to abandon the Zoroastrian image of Alexander and replace it with the Islamic Arabic one. This is the greatest example of how cultural melt and syncretism actually works. Nations and political regimes simply pick historical symbols and use them as they see it. The bright figure in history remains, but how they interpret it, in which light they rediscover it, in which light they portray the symbol to ordinary people, in which light they write about him. It is completely the choice of the nation, the time, and the political regime in charge. There is one more layer to this story that almost nobody talks about, the Jewish aspect. And yes, how can we tell this story without it? The chapter of Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran was not revealed randomly. It was revealed because of a direct challenge from Jewish rabbis. The story goes like this. The Quraysh tribe, the tribe Muhammad descended from, sent two men to the Jewish rabbis in Medina to test whether Muhammad was a true prophet. The rabbis told them, ask Muhammad about three things. One of them was specifically about a man who traveled to the east and west of the earth, and the rabbis already knew the right answer. Muhammad took 2 weeks to respond, and when he did, he said exactly what the rabbis expected. He told the legend of the two-horned one, the legend of Alexander. So the Jewish community of Arabia already knew this story before the Quran was revealed. It was circulating among them independently. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote about Alexander as a ruler blessed by Yahweh, a king who read the book of Daniel, respected Jewish culture, and was chosen by God to rule. In Christian tradition, he was blessed by God. In Arabic tradition, he was blessed by Allah. And before all of that, and the very root of the story, he was blessed by Amun in Egypt. Every step of the way he was blessed. Every tradition that touched this story needed him to be chosen by something divine. Even here the story travels from religion to religion, but the root is always the same. And Alexander appears in Jewish tradition not just as a conqueror, but as a mediator, translating Jewish beliefs and customs to his fellow Macedonians, a bridge between worlds, which is exactly what he has always been. So what we can derive from this is simple. The story didn't come from one direction or one road. It came from Greeks, Jews, Syriac manuscripts, Christians, and Egyptian culture simultaneously. And it is not surprising that by the time the Quran was revealed, this story was already well known across the entire Arabian Peninsula. Because even considering that the vast majority of the population was Arab, the minorities living among them, the Jews, the Greeks, the Christians, the traders from every corner of the ancient world, in all of their cultures, the same story was already famous, already circulating, already alive. By the time the Quran was revealed, the legend of the two-horned righteous ruler was not introduced to the Arab world. It was already there. It was simply in the air. So let's go back to where we started. You are the ancient pagan god of the ram horns. You began in an Egyptian temple. You are a sacred symbol of the ram horns, the central figure in Egyptian mythology and religion. Then the Greek conqueror comes and claims these ram horns as his own. He takes you with him on his journey across the known world, and you became the symbol of probably the greatest conqueror in the history of humanity, Alexander the Great. Then early Christian storytellers baptized you and made you a gift from the monotheistic God. The horns are no longer pagan, and you are no longer the conqueror. No, you are the righteous king on the earth, the chosen one. After that, a lost Arabic translation carried you across the desert, carried you from Greek and Syriac culture into the heart of the Arabic culture. But why did they carry you so far? Because you were still in the realm of Abrahamic religions, and every Abrahamic tradition needed a righteous ruler appointed by God. And you fit perfectly. And so you ended up in the holiest book of Islam as the symbol of a righteous ruler appointed by Allah. That journey didn't happen by accident. It happened because symbols do not belong to anyone. They belong to whoever needs them, to fit their times, their needs, their prospects, and how they see their future. This is not a story about Islam borrowing from paganism. This is a story about how all human traditions are built upon each other, borrow from each other, and are fundamentally interconnected with each other. Because on the controversies of each ideology, the next ideology builds itself. And ironically, each ideology, after each ideology, tries to deny that it was built upon the one that came before it, tries to erase the foundation it stands on, tries to pretend it appeared from nowhere. But here is what the great cultural melt actually looks like. You traveled 1,000 years and 1,000 times, and nobody even noticed.